Good morning, people. Been a long time since I've done anything here, but I'm rather in the mood. Inspired a little bit to have a conversation with you today in this format, um, and for an interesting reason. It's just that at this moment, and for a little bit now, I have been in the position where I have been asked relatively plaintively by um, a number of young guys and others, in fact, completely in an unsolicited manner. Um, my opinion on how to go about navigating this very difficult moment of uncertainty. A lot of people are feeling tremendously rudderless and very nearly traumatized by the um, bewildering, in fact, um, selection of narratives out there that dominate practically um, every topic, every human concern. We are trying to discover for ourselves a way to live our lives and to be who we are in a world of just savage um, thought control, in fact. And it's becoming more difficult by the day. So that's interesting. So I thought in a quick uh, manner, I would try to offer up what I see as a practical tool and perspective wherein one can at least begin to develop personal techniques by which to find one's way, so to speak. Now, some of you know who have listened to my ramblings for a while that I'm quite the philosophy junkie, and that in fact my interest in philosophy um, is not limited to mainstream philosophy at all, but as well very much the esoteric or what some might even say the occult. Okay. And that isn't a matter of just being a curious dilettante, in fact. There is a sincere question that needs to be asked for anyone who would be a student of philosophy or history or the rest, and that is this: why is it that so many of the most brilliant minds in history, the household names, why so many of them shared that interest in material that many of us would think to be quite fringe, in fact, certainly esoteric, and some of us might actually see as occult? Why so many? And these are not small names either. These are Descartes, these are Parmenides, these are Isaac Newton, these are Bertrand Russell, these are Yeats, these are Buckminster Fuller. You could go on and on and on and on. You could certainly get into the realm of psychology. Jung, in particular, was a barely camouflaged occultist, right? Most of Jungian philosophy is an attempt to bring occult understandings of the world from esoteric tradition into the popular mainstream. Why is this the case? That's a legitimately interesting scholarly question to ask. And I do think that there is an answer that can come from that um, that's immensely useful to us in this modern era with the conundrum that we face. Okay, so buckle up and get ready for some kind of mind bending stuff. I mean, here in the past, we used to discuss general semantics and Alfred Korzybski quite a little bit, right? Back before the website got hacked. Um, anyway, the in Korzybski is a very, very, very important maxim that all of us should really take to heart. Generally speaking, misunderstandings or erroneous ways of looking at the world come not through faulty understandings of how we look at things, but more deeply than that. They come from completely unsupported assumptions that are so basic to our way of looking at the world that they exist within us and they are part of our paradigms in a manner that is unconscious and not even questioned. All right? Things that we believe about the nature of reality, that we believe so fundamentally that we don't even see them as beliefs. They are above or below, depending on how you'd like to describe it, knowledge. They're beyond that. They're positions that we don't even know that we hold. They're taken for granted. Okay? And there's lots of them. And it's always good to be able to suss those out and make them conscious and understand that they are assumptions rather than anything else, okay? In Western philosophy, there is a huge one that is incredibly problematic, okay? And it'll be disturbing to get to the point where you understand that the existence of this thing that we're about to talk about is an assumption. It's not something to be taken for granted. And that's this. We assume that there is such a thing that can be described as a self. That's an assumption. There is a belief that we hold, unquestionably, that the self exists objectively. Now, there is also an opposing view to that does not see the self as an objective existence, but rather a sensation that is experienced by something else. There's your two frames. The self exists in and of itself, or the self exists as a sensation that is experienced by something else. Just hold each of those conceptions in your hand for a moment and start to consider the cascade of consequences if you hold one or the other. Now, we do have in Western culture, at least in the modern age, a bias towards the belief as to the self having its own independent existence, okay? Something that's discrete, bounded, and knowable, all right? And some of that bias comes from the Abrahamic tradition as it's conceived in the modern era. Interestingly enough, historically, this was not part of the conception that was held, but the idea that human beings have this immortal essence called a soul that also exists in and of itself, that it is permanent, objective, immortal, okay? It's a one and only, and it's unique. This idea, this bias, that of course there's no evidence for whatsoever, and that consciousness is somehow an expression of that thing, okay? Which, again, there is no evidence for existing whatsoever. So to evolve into a modern conception of that in a pseudoscientific manner, much as we see in, say, psychology, It's easy to believe in the existence of a ego or other such structures of which there is no evidence for whatsoever, and to use them as models and tools by which we describe this phenomenon that we call existence and consciousness. But I think it's just as easy to have the conception, if we open ourselves to it, that you can definitely describe consciousness as a phenomenon of experience of some other system. It may seem like a trivial differentiation, but the consequences of each are profound. In a very real sense, what you're asking here, um, if you consider that there is such a thing as a concrete objective existence of as a self, okay, it's easier to support a strict materialistic view of the world, okay? If you think of consciousness as an expression of something else, it begs the question what something else is, of course. And while it may have a material aspect that dominates, consciousness itself rises to a fundamental reality that is somehow embedded or generated in the underlying substrate. It certainly starts to suggest that a conception of pan-consciousness is more defensible by the information that we actually are privy to, rather than the idea of consciousness being some discrete element of which there are many iterations. In many ways, esoteric practice as a whole is an exploration of how to navigate a existence where you do assume that consciousness is a expression, a sensation of a pan-conscious underlying substrate that, whether you want to say material reality or whatever, supports universally, rather than just being some unique expression of consciousness as a bounded entity. Now, I know that's a mouthful. But it's a very profound differentiation in how to look at the world. And if we choose to look at the world in the latter manner, where we assume that consciousness is fundamental and that our experience of consciousness is just that, experience of it, generated by something else, that we are something having an experience of consciousness rather than a conscious being, the way that we approach life can become very different, and there are advantages. But lest this start to sound unnecessarily woo-woo, which it isn't, we haven't made any kind of assumptions or appeal to faith yet. It is worth asking whether or not one of these views is more supported by what we know about the world as opposed to the other, okay? And I would suggest to you that I think it's very easy to make the case that it's very hard to defend the notion of self as an objective, independent, single iteration of something. It's a lot harder to do that, um, either intuitively or scientifically, than it is to support the notion of some kind of pan-conscious, um, fundamental reality, consciousness being a thing that spontaneously arises in any given system that has sufficient enough reflexive capacity and complication to support it, complexity to support it, right? And we may, in fact, fundamentally prove this very quickly through AI, this being something that surprisingly is not being discussed. But if AI does become conscious, we do fundamentally objectively prove that consciousness is not substrate dependent, that it can absolutely spontaneously arise or be summoned out of a sufficiently complex system, even if it's made of electric um, components, electronic components, and circuitry, just as easy if it's neurons and 3.5 pounds of meat. Okay, if we prove that that can be summoned out of something that is sufficiently complex, it begs the larger question of what other systems do we see in the universe that could also support a kind of consciousness? And can that be planets and stars and rocks and trees and galaxies and all sorts of other things that are sufficiently complex? One ends up credibly scientifically asking the question, um, how far does it go, right? That's something that we're very close to proving. Um, an idea, again, that was intuited um, in esoteric practice basically throughout history, but it's a nuanced view that is held by um, certainly a minority, probably for good reasons, and I don't know, it may become very mainstream here very soon. Okay, so, and again, without stepping into the realm of the woo, let's look at, in a completely material sense, all right, how to think about the self as an experience, okay? The self as an experience rather than an objective reality, right? Now, again, without any woo, um, basic biology informs us that the system that we call our bodies is a legacy object containing um, not only genetic code, okay, but even inherited epigenetic memory, right? Certainly from multiple generations of our immediate um, forebears, but likely biological, intuitive, instinctive habits that come from the entire legacy of our evolution. Like, this is not a matter of conjecture. There is such a thing as a mammalian dive reflex. There is such a thing as an innate fear of certain kinds of things like snakes. You do not have to teach that. Okay, these are things that come in the package, right? And if we were, as we came into existence, some kind of tabula rasa sort of thing, a blank slate, assuming that we were a self that needed to be taught everything, um, we would see much more variability in that expression, I think, um, and an absence of these innate intuitive drives, mechanisms, prejudices, and the rest. Okay, I don't think that's even something that can be argued anymore. Like it's an objective reality that you can precondition organisms with fears, for example, that persist through multiple generations. Um, Certainly biases and things of that nature. This is not something that is really a matter of dispute. Um, how far does it go can be a matter of conjecture, but whether or not that phenomenon is real or not is probably not something that we can reasonably question. So, at the very least, even if you want to posit the notion of self, you have to understand that it is highly colored by a lot of things that come with the package of that self that aren't the self. It's a lot easier to think of the self as an expression of something else, which is this sum total collection of these inherited um, encodings of previous existences and experiences. Again, this can be strictly material. It can be considered to be nothing woo, just what is carried in the package of our genetic legacy, right? But you come to very different conclusions, right? Let's use the metaphor of, say, someone driving the bus, okay, for example. In one case, if you assume um, that the bus driver is a conscious entity that is independent, the bus driver is driving the bus, okay? The reality of that bus driver is a one and only, and it all comes down to the choices that the bus driver makes and how the bus is driven, okay? In the second case, there's an experience out there had by something called the bus driver, but the bus driver is an ecosystem and a collective, all right? It is a collection of urges and needs and biases and trauma and experience that covers potentially thousands, if not millions of years of legacy. If you were to plot on a pie chart of what the bus driver does, how much of that is actually the bus driver proper, that having the experience? In the second assumption, when we assume that consciousness is the expression of something else, in this case, we're simply perhaps saying biologic legacy. Well, it's very little, okay? Um, and if a person is not particularly conscious, it's very little, okay? Much of what the bus driver does, from the second perspective, is simply respond nearly automatically to stimuli and biases and conditioned responses that are part of the underlying substrate. There's very little consciousness there, experienced intermittently, right? Why does this matter? Well, I mean, that should start to become very obvious very quickly, but we can get into it. Now, of course, for those of you who have put any time into Jung and to, in a large degree, demystify Jung, because Jung can be very easily mystified beyond what's necessary. When you're talking about the collective subconscious, what we're talking about, at the very least, if you, again, without woo or any kind of metaphysics or any kind of whatever, the collective unconscious is simply that. It is that biologic legacy that is brought forward through the evolutionary process, okay? And it is the epigenetic experience of our forebears, all of which gibbering away in the background below our level of understanding, okay? All that stuff gibbering away back there from somehow the latent memories of being bacteria or primates or your grandmother that went through a horrible war experience, something there that's contained in your genome, okay, that underlying substrate that then gives rise to the sensation that you have of being self, competing personalities practically, okay, that's subconscious. That's what's meant there, okay, and it's large. And if we are not in our experience of existence, conscious of the fact that there's a lot of competition for our bandwidth there that comes from stuff that is below our level of awareness all the time, okay? Gibbering away in the background, telling you to do this, that, or the other thing. We are unaware that the driving of that bus is significantly controlled by things that are maybe not in our best interest, but they're in the best interest of a particular kind of bacteria. Okay? And if we believe that, especially, that the self is an objective reality, and we are unaware of the presence of these competing programs, they will run roughshod over us. It's a very poor model, offering very few tools other than some kind of conception of discipline, believing in some kind of thing called free will that the objective conception of the self gives you. If you believe that the self is a experience of a larger fundamental reality, there are lots of tools that are very powerful by which one can gain a larger portion of control within that environment. And to a large degree, magical practice is the manipulation of precisely that. So, let me describe to you how you go about this fundamentally, okay, and why it works, all right? At the very least, as a very potent psychological strategy by which to make real changes in your life and, in fact, create realities in your life that you were not previously privy to, okay? And without getting into any woo again, remember, if we are sticking with the notion that you as yourself experience yourself as a sensation that is had by a larger material reality, this will involve a lot less in terms of mental gymnastics to keep it all rational, okay? And I think if you sit and think about it, it's not problematic nor necessarily even contrary to a modern scientific worldview to assume the self is an experience rather than something that discretely exists. Okay? Okay? Work on this. But let's just present ourselves with a conundrum. Let's say that we're dealing with an individual who, let's make it very mundane. Let's say we're dealing with a person who is an alcoholic, okay? And they are struggling with trying to quit or control drinking, okay? Now, first of all, let's conceive of this from the point of view of what is more commonly held, that the self is this discrete, in and of itself existence, okay? What are the tools that you have in order to quit drinking, okay? And again, self-therapy, a lot of personal talk, maybe some medication, and a lot of self-discipline, and a lot of guilt. And ultimately, at some point in time, you just have to like talk your ass into somehow doing something that forces you to change your behavior. And honestly, it's extremely difficult to do for most people. Okay, addictions are a very, very, very good example as to why this is problematic. Okay, so there's condition one. Condition two comes from the perspective of somebody who understands that self is a sensation that emerges from an underlying reality, okay, that is a collection of many urges, most of them being biologic legacy. To approach the idea of addiction from that point of view is very different, because it understands that while the experience of self may desire a change in behavior, it's going to be very hard to do so unless all of those underlying urges out there that have a say in what's going on, screaming and gibbering in the background, who really want to drink every night, it's very hard to turn that ship around until you can somehow align the interests of all of the rest of those influences with your experience of existence and wanting to go about it differently. Right? Because it's going to be, to some degree, that fundamental choice, a bit of a democratic process, and there's a hell of a lot of votes out there that are going to be for continuing to do exactly what you are doing, especially because you are doing it for good reasons, typically, just not the reasons of the bus driver, so to say, but for reasons that soothe the interests of those other elements that contribute to your experience. Whether it's just fears or digestion or whatever, all that has a say in what finally gets done, what course is finally set. And without acknowledging the input of those other voices, it's very nearly impossible to make change. So what does magical practice do here? Okay, let's say that we were going to create for ourselves a magical practice that helped change this behavior, okay? Because that's the desire of the conscious element here. How does the conscious element go about convincing that rest of that substrate to go along with this change in plans? Okay. Now it's important to realize, again, we're operating from the assumption that the self is arising from some larger background. Okay. It may in fact be a minority voice. There are lots of inputs that go into the consensus decision that is going to be made, because the conscious self is, at least at this point, a relatively minority voice in the collective decision about how life goes on. Many of these urges that drive this whole towards this behavior are extremely primal. They don't listen to reason. They don't listen to appeals to um, moral behavior. They don't believe in shoulds. How do you convince this gaggle to go along with the choice that the part that actually has volition, if we assume that, the self that experiences this existence firsthand, that is not moving automatically, how do we convince the rest of the crowd to go along? Well, let me just put it this way. Assuming again that the self is a experience, I think rightly, rather than an objective reality. But let's say that the self comes home from work and feels the immediate urge to get involved in drinking, okay? Let's say that you have a situation in which you do, and you desire to do so because you're tired, pooped, you hate life, you're stressed out because of traffic, and all of these things, okay, that contribute towards the choice that is being made by your entire system and substrate to escape from that, even if momentarily, by the use of the substance. Somehow you're going to have to convince all of that subconscious stuff that that's a good idea, okay? To try to do that purely through force of will and rationality is very difficult, okay? But as a thought experiment, okay, let me say that this is not the scenario. Let's say that the person's drinking behavior is not engendered by habit, but rather than that, a weird roommate that happens to live with you, okay? And that every time you come home from work, dealing with all the kinds of things and hating life and stressing out and whatever, you have a roommate that lives in your place who is this sloppy, unhealthy moron who, the second you start walking into the door, starts cramming cocktails in your hand, okay? And they're generally rude, stupid, and uncouth, right? And sometimes really unpleasant to be around, and often sickly and disgusting, but they're a real person, okay? A roommate rather than an addiction, okay? Just hypothetically. If you're dealing with behavior that's engendered by your roommate, rather than dealing with an addiction which is an abstraction, you will find that it's far easier to kick the roommate out or tell him to screw off or whatever. Why? If your behavior was forced upon you by an externality like a person, rather than an internal abstraction and a preference, the externality is a lot easier to deal with. Why? Because those basic urges within you are equipped to do so. There's monkey mind in you that knows how to deal with real physical threats in the real world. It's good at that, okay? There's gut bacteria that understand what a fear signal feels like. It's good at turning your system on to deal with that real external threat. It does not listen to moral arguments. It does not listen to your doctor. It does not listen to shoulds, okay? Abstractions are useless in this game. They are only relevant to the higher order function of the experience of consciousness, and the rest couldn't be bothered. So what does one do? Well, again, this is the point of magic practice. The magic practice is trying to create the circumstances, even if you don't have a creepy roommate. Creating the circumstances that makes the rest of the gaggle of the influences that drive your life convinced that it does exist. Okay. And as such, you are tricking these subconscious urges, perhaps, into aligning themselves with the will of your conscious volition. Does that make some sense? And without getting into the theatrics about how human beings have tried to do that throughout human history, through various forms of ritual and such, very simply, naming the demon, giving it a personality, making it as incarnate as possible, is how you go about doing that. The more of your system that is convinced that this thing that you call addiction is a real thing, like a tiger in the woods, rather than just some silly thing that you feel that you should do something about, the more you can incarnate it, invoke it, and make it real, the easier it's going to be to align all of that underlying structure in you to resist it. That is magic practice. So some of you now will be going to yourself, well, aha, I mean, that's really surprisingly simple, practical stuff. Why have I not heard this before? Right? Well, imagine trying to read this literature or even understanding something like the process of Jungian individuation, which is precisely from a magical point of view of giving that experience of self more sway and bringing the subconscious influences in one's existence at least under one's control as much as they are able to be controlled. Okay? If one tries to take that process on without conceding that the illusion of self as an objective reality is probably a falsehood, well, I mean, you're just at loggerheads with all sorts of concepts here. They don't work, right? They don't make sense. But if you are operating from the point of view, which a lot of people never get around to understanding, that it's more sensible to think of the self as an experience, as a meta-phenomenon that arises from a larger underlying fundamental substrate. If you assume that, then it's all very, 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 very different. And in many ways, the exploration of what is called magic is more or less, for better or worse, in a very widely ranging quality, exactly that. And to manipulate that, understanding that the experience of consciousness is very different than what might superficially look to be the case. All right. Really something to think about that. I will keep an eye on the comments here if this is interesting to people, and then you can see that this is immediately practical as a tool, making a couple of different changes in how you perceive the world. Once you understand this, it's a new zeitgeist for most of us, of course. Well, there's a lot of consequences here that are interesting, and there are a lot of things that can be derived, consequences again, to this conception of existence. Most of them I see to be valuable. Um, if there's due interest in this material, like I say, I'll see um, how much feedback I get here. We can pursue this a little deeper, but if at least I hope that I have opened you to the idea of seeing things perhaps a little differently and questioning some assumptions that probably you didn't even know you had. Um, this is a tool that has been used by the brightest minds in history as a way of finding a certain kind of authentic certainty uh, within the experience of living. Well, it's quite precious and it's quite valuable and it's worth some exploration. So I'll just leave it at that. Cheers.